something that has been kept silent for centuries, hidden thousands of miles from the Vatican, preserved by men who died copying words Rome never intended the world to read. This is the kind of discovery that doesn't just change belief, it changes the ground beneath your feet. What I saw in the mountains of Ethiopia wasn't myth, wasn't folk legend, wasn't an internet conspiracy. They were concrete manuscripts, handwritten on parchment, kept in wooden vaults since before Europe as we know it existed. And what these manuscripts say about Jesus after the resurrection is so radical, so disturbing, so politically dangerous, that reading them only takes once to understand why they never crossed the sea to the west. This journey began in 1998, but its effects only exploded much later. That year, I was in Addis Ababa, researching a controversial book, when an Orthodox priest said something to me, matter-of-factly, that chilled my blood. You people in the West don't know even half of what Jesus said after rising from the dead. It haunted me. Half what was removed. Who decided what would be forgotten and what would be remembered? And for what purpose? Days later, I was taken to a monastery carved into the rock. The climb wasn't by stairs or ramp, it was by rope. They literally strap you to the chest and pull you to the top of a vertical wall. As I climbed, feeling the rope scrape against my skin, a question lingered. What kind of knowledge needs to be protected to this extent? What kind of text justifies physical risk to reach? Once there, the monks opened boxes containing Bibles over 1,000 years old. Among them was a book written in Jais, the ancient Ethiopian liturgical language. When the abbot translated the first line, I didn't feel like someone receiving information. I felt like someone being punched in the gut. Jesus didn't just reappear after the resurrection, he taught, warned, prophesied, and commanded for a full 40 days. And none of this is in Western Bibles. Why? Who decided to amputate this part? What institution has the authority to silence the resurrected Christ himself? Machiavelli wrote that power does not fear spiritual truth. It fears truths that undermine the authority of those who govern. The inevitable question is, were these texts excluded because they were false or because they were too powerful to be permitted? Were they rejected for lack of authenticity or because they were too impactful? We're not talking about a marginal pamphlet, but an entire tradition preserved outside Roman influence. If this is true, then the Christ we know is merely the version that survived the filter of power. And there is no greater theological wound than this, realizing that perhaps what we call the complete gospel is, in fact, a gospel summarized by human decree. Before continuing and revealing the content of these manuscripts, what exactly Jesus said during these 40 days, why this material was rejected, and how it redefines Christianity. If this topic interests you, subscribe to the channel now and like this video so this investigation doesn't die in the algorithm as it did in the councils. The next part begins exactly where Rome preferred the narrative to end. What was removed wasn't a detail, it was the exposed nerve of Christianity. When the abbot began translating the contents of those manuscripts, the first thing that fell apart was the idea that Jesus had merely appeared briefly to prove he was alive and then disappeared. In the Ethiopian texts, he appears not as a pious reminder, but as someone who overcame the fabric of reality and returned urgently to instruct. No longer speaking as a master of parables, but as a king who returned from the other side with complete knowledge. His first words, according to the manuscript, are a blow against everything that institutional Christianity would become. He asserts that conquering death was not the end, but only the beginning, and that the disciples should spread the message not with the sword, but with inner fire, because the true war would be spiritual, not military. This kind of statement is not just theological, it's political. Machiavelli would say that such a message disarms the need for religious mediation and restores spiritual autonomy to the individual. And this is precisely where the text becomes dangerous. Jesus prophesies that the church itself, built in his name, would end up betraying his essence. He says that religious leaders would build magnificent temples while ignoring the most important temple, the inner one. He claims that millions would use his image while abandoning his voice. This kind of diagnosis doesn't serve power, it serves lucidity. Questions begin to arise like barbs in the mind. How many times in history has someone spoken of God while acting against the poor? How many cathedrals were built with money that should have fed children? How many wars were justified with the excuse of Christ's name? This text doesn't point to theories, it points to the facts of everyday human life. Just look at religious leaders who live like heads of state. Just notice the lavish broadcasts, the illuminated pulpits, the speeches about prosperity, while entire families sleep on the streets under neon crosses. The most disturbing part of these manuscripts is the serenity with which Jesus describes something that would only happen centuries later, like a doctor who sees the disease in the patient's eyes even before the symptoms appear. He says, "A time will come when my words will be used against me." Today, anyone can open social media and watch pastors defend corrupt politicians as if they were divine messengers. They can see the name of Christ in election campaigns, in culture wars, in the commerce of faith. Exactly as prophesied, the name remains, the content is changed. It is at this point that the reading ceases to be historical and becomes intimate, because the text not only describes the corruption of institutions, it describes the tendency of human beings themselves. Machiavelli would say that man prefers the appearance of virtue to virtue itself, and Jesus in the manuscripts confirms this when he says that many would preach in his name without ever obeying him. Corruption begins in the human desire to appear righteous without paying the price of becoming righteous. Before we move on to the next part, where I'll show specific excerpts from these texts, the kind of teachings never included in Western Bibles and which completely redefine the understanding of the resurrection, I need to ask you something simple. Subscribe to the channel now, like it, share it with someone seeking truth, and comment on what you've noticed about the use of Christ's name in history. This is no ordinary documentary. This is the reopening of a historical wound that was forcibly sewn shut. The next part delves precisely into the teachings that were removed before you were born. The passage Rome never allowed you to read. The most disconcerting aspect of all this research was not the spiritual content itself, but the historical engineering that concealed it. Most people think the Bible has always been a closed, stable, and universal set. This was never true. During the first centuries, different Christian communities read different texts. In Alexandria, some Gospels circulated. In Syria, others. In Ethiopia, still others. Only when Christianity became politically useful to the Roman Empire did the need for an official canon arise. An empire does not govern over divergent texts, governs over an authorized version. Here's the detail that's almost never mentioned. Those who decided what would or wouldn't remain in the canon weren't disciples, prophets, or angels. They were men sitting in councils under the influence of emperors, choosing which books would best support the power structure. This doesn't invalidate what we have, but it does expose what's missing. The question that should remain is simple. What was removed by faith or by government convenience? The Ethiopian texts escaped this filter for a reason that has nothing mystical about it. It has geography and politics. Ethiopia was outside of Rome's orbit, protected by mountains and deserts, and developed an autonomous Christian tradition, unaffected by the empire's rules. While Rome burned manuscripts deemed dangerous, Ethiopian monks copied them by hand for generations. How can one explain that the only reason a teaching of Jesus survived is because it was physically far from the center of power? There's something unsettling about this observation. What is true doesn't always survive by force of truth, but by historical contingency. How many truths have been destroyed not by error, but by fear? How many traditions have disappeared because they threatened those in power, not because they were false? Historical silence is almost never innocent. Understanding this changes the way we view faith No one should be surprised that Rome selected texts that reinforced obedience, hierarchy, priestly mediation, and submission. Organizations preserve what keeps them standing, not what dismantles them. Machiavelli would say that the church, like any power structure, chooses doctrine with the same logic a prince chooses advisors, not by virtue, but by utility. The intellectual shock here isn't religious, it's structural. We're accustomed to thinking that theological truth has been preserved because it's true. But what if the real criterion were, does this keep the machine running? What happens to faith when we realize it was edited with the same tools used to write a constitution or a civil code? Before we move on to the next part, where I'll dive directly into the strategic, explicit, documented reasons that explain why these texts were deleted, I need your active participation. Comment now on what you think of the content so far. Tell me if it makes sense, if it raises doubts, if it challenges something you believed. This video only exists because someone before us refused to remain silent. Interacting, commenting, and sharing are the minimum act of resistance against deletion. In the next part, I'll show you not only what was removed, but also why someone considered it dangerous for you to know. As the abbot delved deeper into the manuscript, the tone shifted from merely theological to almost surgical. Jesus describes what would happen throughout history with a precision that is not coincidental. Religious leaders would accumulate wealth while speaking of renunciation. Temples would be built while the poor died at their gates. Rulers would use his name as a seal of political legitimacy. Faith would be transformed into a commodity. It's not difficult to verify this is no vague prophecy. It's a snapshot of the present. A report released by the Pew Research Center shows that religious organizations in the United States alone generate approximately $1.2 trillion annually, including donations, media, universities, properties, and faith-related businesses. This is more than the GDP of 170 countries. Jesus, in the Ethiopian manuscripts, said we would see exactly this. My name will be used to build kingdoms that are not mine. The prediction came true with mathematical precision. Who dares to call this a coincidence? Another point in the manuscript violently impacts everyday life. Jesus describes a time when truth would be drowned out not by force, but by an excess of voices, massive noise, not explicit censorship. Today, anyone carries a lifetime of sermons in their pocket, but doesn't transform a single thought. Information has replaced conversion. Multitudes consume religion as content, not as a path. How many hours of Christian videos are watched per day on YouTube, while their own spiritual life remains intact? This prophecy is no longer distant, it is daily. There's also a part of the text that seems written for our century. Lies will be proclaimed as truth from the highest places, and anyone who speaks the truth will be treated as an enemy. Just look at the last decade. Whistleblowers, scientists, independent journalists. Whistleblowers almost always treated as threats and punished not for mistakes, but for touching on structures that cannot be exposed. Truth today is not fought with arguments. It is fought with discrediting, exactly as predicted. This section of manuscripts ends with the most dire warning. There will come a point when God's own people will no longer recognize the voice of the God they claim to follow. In practice, this means that religion continues, liturgy continues, worship continues, but without a real presence. This prognosis is not metaphysical, it is sociological. Faith without transformation becomes ritual without consequence, and ritual without consequence becomes an instrument of power. How many Christians today defend practices, discourses, and policies that Jesus would reject outright? How many times, in the name of Christ, do the exact opposite of Christ? Reading this passage doesn't just produce intellectual discomfort, produces historical shame. Because it shows that it's not just that the church became corrupt, it's that the corruption was foreseen in advance, denounced before it happened, and yet it still happened. The problem wasn't ignorance, it was choice. In the next part of this video, I'll delve into the manuscript's most radical twist, not just the analysis of the collapse, but the announcement of where restoration would come from. And it's not from the center, not from the leaders, not from the cathedrals. Before moving on, comment below what shocked you most in this part: the political use of faith, the volume of religious money in the world, or the predictability of spiritual corruption. Your participation keeps this content alive and shows that we're not speaking into a vacuum. In the next stage of the translation, the abbot advanced to the part of the manuscripts where Jesus not only denounces what would happen to his message, but also reveals how truth would return to the surface after everything had been corrupted. He doesn't say that the return of truth would come from the great religious centers, nor from councils, nor from doctors of the law. Rather, he affirms that renewal would arise from places where no one looks, from those whom no one consults, from those who have no name but bear scars. This phrase shifts all historical expectations. What we always imagine comes from above, he affirms will come from below. This point gains even more strength when the text describes who these bearers of the return would be: the enslaved, the persecuted, the poor, the forgotten, the displaced. People without political clout, without institutional prestige, without a pulpit. This contradicts all Western religious logic. The history of the Church tends to look to Rome, to cathedrals, to synods, to great leaders. But the manuscript states that the truth, when it speaks again, will not come from the thrones of religion, but from the excluded. This begs the question: why would the structures of faith fear this kind of teaching so much that they erased it for centuries? There's an even more incisive detail. In this text, Jesus says that his voice would be recognized not by titles, but by a hallmark: consistency between suffering and fidelity. He says that the sign of authenticity in the end times would be those who, even crushed, would still maintain spiritual integrity. This creates an uncomfortable moral mirror. In practice, it means that the measure of truth is not in the size of the institution, but in the character of its little ones. This teaching has direct consequences for everyday life. Who are those today who live their faith outside the window, without profit, without an audience, without seeking prestige? Who are those who remain faithful even when it yields nothing in return? Who are those who continue to believe even without ever receiving applause, a platform, or social return? The Ethiopian text says that it is from these kinds of people that restoration will come, not from microphones, but from human deserts. In a particularly powerful passage, Jesus states, "The light will not return by the way it came." This means that the same structure that received the truth in the first century will not be the same one through which it will return in the latter. Restoration will not pass through the same institutional gate. This explains the discomfort of those in power. If the truth returns through the margins, there will be no way to claim dominion over it. This dismantles any pretense of religious exclusivity. Listening to this translation by candlelight in Debadamo, I had the impression that these words didn't belong to the past. They described the present and posed a demand to decide which side of spiritual history one is on the side of those who maintain appearance, power, and name, or on the side of those who uphold truth even in anonymity. This kind of text is not just revelation, it is provocation. In the next section, I'll address the most delicate point: the moment when this research ceased to be historical and became personal, when the presence I encountered on that mountain demanded an irreversible choice. Before continuing, comment on this video on what struck you most in this section: the idea that truth returns through the excluded, the displacement of religious authority, or the fact that Jesus foresaw the method of restoration centuries before it happened. What you write here is part of this process of bringing to light what they tried to keep silent. When I left Ethiopia after that last night, I already knew that this material wasn't just an academic find, it was a summons. Because knowing is harmless acting, after knowing is what creates friction in the world. These texts weren't preserved out of historical curiosity. but to produce a spiritual and existential consequence in those who encounter them. What Jesus teaches there isn't to be admired, it's to be practiced. The plan is clear within the manuscripts themselves. Restoration will not come through speeches, but through transformed lives. The first application is not external, it is internal. Jesus says that body, mind, and spirit must be aligned until one's entire existence becomes a living evidence. This begins with 3 simple yet radical practices: daily silence, examination of thoughts, and coherence between faith and action. Daily silence means sustaining awareness even when nothing happens. This breaks the addiction to noise and makes the soul available for real perception. Examining thoughts means identifying where impulses arise: fear, vanity, pride, competition they cannot govern. Consistency means not allowing faith to be a verbal embellishment. If you believe in compassion, practice it. If you believe in truth, speak it. If you believe in renunciation, choose it. If you believe in fidelity, maintain it. No counsel can replace this kind of testimony. There is also a social dimension to these teachings. Jesus says the truth will resurface in those who suffer without giving up. What does this mean in practice? It means stopping measuring spirituality by stage or influence and beginning to recognize it where it truly is. In the widow who shares what little she has, in the condemned who forgives, in the sick who maintains hope, in the anonymous who is not corrupted. Whoever wants to follow this hidden Christ must shift their gaze, stop seeking God in the center, and start tracking Him on the edges. A third practical point is to be vigilant about how the name of Christ is used. Before repeating any religious discourse, ask yourself, does this serve power or transformation? Does it strengthen the conscience or just the group? Does it produce real life or just a label? The Ethiopian text shows that corruption doesn't begin externally, it begins when people use the right name to justify wrong intentions. The practice is to reverse the order. First purify the intention, then name the faith. None of this is simple. That's why the texts were hidden. They don't comfort, they demand. They don't offer an easy religion. They offer radical responsibility. The viewer who has reached this point must decide what relationship they will have with this truth, content or commitment. Revelation only fulfills its purpose when someone incorporates it into their daily lives, in speech, in choices, and in the necessary losses it imposes. Before I wrap up this section, I want to ask you something directly. If this content moved you in any way, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment. Tit can be anonymous, telling what it provoked in you, which part of you challenged you the most, or what you intend to change from now on. This simple act is the way to keep what you've seen from dying within you. Knowledge without an answer turns to dust. Knowledge answered becomes destiny. Now that you know, the answer isn't intellectual, it's who you decide to be afterward.